Yeah, man, 12 would be right. Sorry, I'm tired.
The scripture reading this morning will be coming from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Good morning. It's so good to see everybody this morning. What a wonderful time we've been able to spend in worship over the last few minutes. Of course, we're thankful for all of our visitors who are here. Thankful that you chose to be with us. We're thankful to be together in the presence of God this morning and to have an opportunity to spend some time in His Word. If you're not already there, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. If you're not already there from our scripture reading and you'd like to follow along, we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, looking at verses 7 through 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. What is your greatest weakness? Take just a minute to think about that question. What is your greatest weakness? As many of you know, growing up and really still today, Superman is one of my favorite superheroes because he's basically able to do anything that he wants to do. He's able to fly. He has superhuman strength and speed. He has laser, X-ray, and heat vision. He has supersonic hearing. He can freeze things with his breath. What do they say about him? He's faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. He can leap over buildings in just a single bound, in my opinion, based on just pure power and strength. You can debate with me after this about services if you want to. But just based on pure power and strength, Superman is the greatest, most powerful. He is the strongest superhero to ever be created. But even Superman, in all of his strength and in all of his power, has a weakness. What happens whenever kryptonite comes into contact with Superman's body, even just a little bit of it? He's not able to do anything. All of that power and strength leaves him. He becomes very weak. The longer that the kryptonite stays around him, the weaker and weaker he becomes. And if that kryptonite stays around him long enough, he's going to die from it. Even Superman has a weakness. So what about you? Whenever you think about your life from a spiritual perspective, whenever you look at your relationship with God, whenever you look at the perfect example of Jesus, and you compare yourself to that, what is your greatest weakness? I don't know what it might be for you. Maybe it's some kind of trauma that you experienced in the past, and it continues to impact how you live today. Maybe it's some kind of physical problem that's changed everything in your life. Some kind of physical problem that changes the way you do things. It's stopping you from doing some of the things that you used to do. Maybe it's more emotional. Maybe you're dealing with a lot of stress, worry, anxiety, guilt. Maybe you're struggling with your self-esteem. Maybe you're really struggling with how you view yourself. Maybe it's something in your character. Perhaps it's your temper. Your inability to say no. How you always are striving to please other people. Maybe you find yourself to be a certain person or when you find yourself in a certain situation, what is your greatest weakness? Nobody can answer that question for you except for you. What if we were to ask that question to the Apostle Paul? What if we were to ask him, what is your greatest weakness? What do you think he would say? What do you think his reply would be? Maybe we sometimes think of Paul as like a spiritual Superman. He's one of the greatest missionaries to ever live. He's one of the greatest preachers to ever preach. And in the way that we sometimes think about Paul, we can never imagine him having any kind of weakness. But then we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and about midway through verse 7, where Paul says, a thorn was given to me in the flesh. We approach this text in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10, where Paul talks about his greatest weakness. When you look at the context of this, Paul is speaking against individuals who he labeled as false apostles or deceitful workmen. He calls them servants of Satan who were disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And so whenever you look in 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, and even into chapter 13, Paul addresses them. He doesn't want to lose the church at Corinth to these false teachers who entered into the congregation to boastfully and pridefully elevate themselves while at the same time attacking the Apostle Paul. Elevating themselves while attacking Paul's authority, attacking Paul's apostleship. So especially when you look at the beginning of chapter 12, Paul meets them where they are. In order to establish his authority, in order to establish his apostleship, and in order to speak against these prideful and boastful false teachers who had entered into the church at Corinth, Paul talks about an event in his life that he very well could have boasted in, that he could have very well taken great pride in. When you read the first 6 verses of chapter 12, yes, he tells it in the third person, but it becomes clear when you keep reading that he's talking about himself. He talks about an event in his life that took place 14 years ago. He says, 14 years ago, I had a vision of the Lord. Paul had a revelation where he was taken up into the third heaven, what he called paradise. He was taken up into the place where God dwelled. He says, this vision, this revelation that I had was so glorious. He said it was so amazing that I can't even describe it. I can't even put it into words. And it's because of that revelation. When you look at verse 7, like what Wesley read for us just a minute ago, it's because of the surpassing greatness, the glory of that vision that Paul had, that this thorn was given to him in the flesh. Paul, I want you to tell me about your greatest weakness. Paul says, okay, let me tell you about this thorn in my flesh. While there have been a lot of different suggestions for what this thorn is, we're not really sure exactly what it was. Paul doesn't tell us. Some people suggest that this thorn was physical. When you read throughout Paul's letters, it seems at some points he had problems with his eyesight. And so maybe that was his thorn in the flesh. And then some people suggest that Paul's thorn in the flesh was more relational. When you look at the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, as Paul talks about these arrogant, prideful, boastful, false teachers, maybe they're the thorn that had been placed in Paul's flesh. But then some people suggest that Paul's thorn was more interpersonal, where he has to struggle with the weight of what he had done in his past, where every day Paul struggles with the guilt of persecuting the church, killing Christians, and that weight continues to be upon him as he goes into the future. We're not exactly sure what this thorn is. Maybe it's physical, maybe it's relational, maybe it's interpersonal. What we do know is how this weakness impacted his life. What we do know is how this thorn made him feel. Think about that phrase for just a minute. A thorn in the flesh. Imagine somebody taking a thorn and sticking it into your side. The thorn's not very big, but it's going to have a big impact. It's going to cause a lot of pain. It's going to cause a lot of difficulty wherever you go. Whatever you're doing, regardless of who you're with, you're going to know that that thorn's there. You're always going to feel it. The pain never goes away. The wound never heals. The bleeding never stops. Paul says, that's where I am. He says, that's what my weakness looks like. I have this thorn in my flesh. Okay, Paul, describe it to me. When you look at verse 7, he calls it a messenger, literally an angel of Satan. It appears that God, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations that Paul received, it appears that God, like Job, allowed Satan to put this thorn in Paul's flesh. He says it's a messenger. It's an angel of Satan. Well, what's the purpose? Why did Satan do that? Again, in verse 7, it's a messenger of Satan, the ESV says, to harass me. That Greek word for harass, when you go to Matthew and Mark, it's the same word that's used to describe how Jesus was punched in the face by the Jews who were accusing him before he's handed over to Pontius Pilate. Paul says, that's what this thorn does to me. That's what my weakness does to me. He says it's always punching me in the face. It's always knocking me down. It's always like that bully standing behind the corner, just waiting for me to walk around. It always continually causes great pain and difficulty in my life. Would you like to get rid of it, Paul? Paul says, of course I would. In verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord. He didn't just ask the Lord, but on 3 different occasions, he begged Jesus to take this thorn away from him. But yet it continued to remain. Like we said, maybe we sometimes view Paul like a spiritual Superman. The greatest missionary to ever live, one of the greatest preachers to ever preach. But like Superman, and like us, Paul had a weakness. And it's a weakness that plagued his life every single day. So let's go back to how we started. What about you? What is your greatest weakness? What is the thorn in your flesh? Are you thinking about it? And how does it make you feel? How does it impact your life? Can you relate to the Apostle Paul? Can you relate to what? Do you feel like you're always walking around with this thorn in your side? And regardless of where you go, regardless of what you're doing, regardless of who you're with, it's always causing pain. It's always causing difficulty. You can always tell that it's right there. What is the messenger of Satan in your life that's harassing you, that's punching you in the face, that's constantly knocking you down? What's the messenger of Satan in your life that you want nothing more than to get rid of? And maybe you've prayed to the Lord about it on multiple occasions to take this thorn out of your side, to take this weakness out of your life, but yet it continues to remain. What is your greatest weakness? What's the thorn in your flesh? And how does it impact you? How does it make you feel? When you take a minute to consider that, you realize coming face to face with our weaknesses is a really difficult thing to do. Confronting, coming face to face with our thorns is very challenging. It's not easy. But this morning, I want us to glean something out of this text that I think can encourage us. Something that we can find hope in. That as we deal with our weaknesses and the pain and difficulty they bring into our lives, I believe this is a thought that can exhort us as we continue to move forward in our relationships with God, and that is the fact that our weaknesses have purpose. While we may want to get rid of them, while we may want to get rid of the pain and difficulty that they cause in our lives, our weaknesses are not for nothing. As Christians, our weaknesses have purpose. Let's see what Paul has to say about that. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians 12. That number one, our weaknesses have purpose because they keep us humble. Look at verse 7. He says, so therefore, as a result of this vision that he talks about in the first 6 verses, he says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, that's plural, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. There was a real danger in Paul's life. As a result of the greatness of the visions and the revelations that he had received, of which the one in 2 Corinthians 12 is an example. There was a real temptation for Paul to become conceited, for Paul to become arrogant, for him to become boastful. There was a temptation for Paul to become like the false teachers that he's writing against. And so 2 different times in verse 7, he says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, in order to keep me from becoming boastful and arrogant, this thorn was given to me in the flesh. In the midst of all these heavenly visions, this thorn kept Paul anchored to the earth. His weakness helped him to have humility. It helped him to be humble. It helped him to fight against the temptation of being boastful, elevating, exalting himself. His weakness had a purpose. It wasn't for nothing. It kept him from becoming conceited. It kept him humble. I think we need to realize the same thing. Our weaknesses have purpose because our weaknesses keep us humble. Here's another opinion of mine that you might want to talk about after the services. In my opinion, Shaquille O'Neal is one of the greatest big men to ever play basketball. He has 4 NBA championships. He won 1 Most Valuable Player award. He's over 7 foot tall. He's big. He's strong. And when he gets the basketball in the post, at least when he did, whenever he was playing, he's retired now. But whenever Shaq got the ball in the post, he was almost impossible to stop. But one thing that most people know about Shaq is that he's terrible at free throws. Almost can't hit a free throw to save his life. That is the weakness of his game. You know, Shaq has a theory about why he's so bad at free throws. In an interview one time, he said the theory is it was the man way upstairs. It was his way of keeping me humble. It was just his way of saying, hey buddy, you're just like everyone else. When I saw this on the internet, my first thought was, did Shaq read 2 Corinthians 12? Before he went to this interview, because his theory about the purpose of his weakness is pretty similar to what Paul says here in the text that's in front of us. At least in his mind, Shaq's weakness had a purpose. In his mind, his weakness kept him humble. His weakness helped him to have humility. Our weaknesses have purpose because they keep us humble. Can you imagine if we didn't have any weaknesses whatsoever? You might know some people in your life who think they have no weaknesses or they like to live as if they have no weaknesses. But can you imagine if that was the reality? If none of us had any weaknesses in our lives, think about the temptation that we would experience. Think about the conceit and the boastfulness and the arrogance that would begin to define our lives if we were strong in every area. Number one, our weaknesses have purpose because they keep us humble. But then the second idea, our weaknesses have purpose because they teach us to rely on Jesus. Look at verse 8. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, here's what Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. How did Paul initially respond to his thorn? How did he initially respond to his weakness? In verse 8, it brought him to his knees. He became very persistent in prayer. On 3 different occasions, not once, not twice, but 3 different times, he begged Jesus to take the thorn away from him, to take his weakness away. Paul trusted that Jesus was capable. Paul believed that Jesus had the power to take his weakness away, and he persistently begged him to do it. As Jesus replies to Paul in verse 9, it was an answer that Paul probably didn't want to hear. But yet it's an answer that's powerful. Well, because Paul was so faithful, Jesus just took the thorn away, didn't he? Paul wouldn't, or rather Jesus wouldn't want one of his greatest apostles to have a weakness. So he took that weakness away. And notice what Jesus said. Again, probably not what Paul wanted to hear, but powerful. My grace is sufficient for you. In other words, Paul, you don't need me to take away the thorn. You don't need me to take away your weakness, because my grace is all that you need. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is enough in your life. It's all that you need. Well, why? Why is your grace sufficient, Jesus? Look at the reason. For my power is made perfect in weakness. As Paul served Jesus, it became very apparent to everybody that it wasn't about Paul. As Paul served Jesus, it wasn't about his ability, it wasn't about his strength, and it wasn't about his experiences, like the visions and the revelations that he had earlier in the chapter. As Paul served Jesus, it was apparent to everybody that it was all about Jesus. That Jesus didn't work through the areas where Paul was strong. Jesus didn't use Paul's strength. Jesus worked through Paul's weakness in order to demonstrate his power to the world, in order to demonstrate his grace in Paul's life. And Paul says, that's why I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. He's not like the false teachers he's writing against. They boast in their strengths. They boast in what they've done. They boast in how they've been elevated in authority. Paul says, I'm more than glad to boast in my weaknesses. Why? Because that's when the power of Jesus can be seen in me. That's when the entire world is able to know that it's not about me, but it's about Jesus. And it's about Him extending His grace and power to the world. He says, that's why I'm content with my weaknesses. But not just my weaknesses, my persecutions and my calamities and my difficulties. Whenever I'm insulted, He says, I'm going to be content. Because it's in those moments where Jesus can be seen most clearly in my life. Paul's weakness served a purpose. It wasn't for nothing. His weakness taught him to rely on Jesus, on His grace, and on His power, instead of relying on himself. We need to realize the same thing. Our weaknesses have purpose because they teach us to rely on Jesus. Again, imagine if we didn't have any weaknesses. If we were strong in every area, we could stand on our own 2 feet. We wouldn't need anything, and we wouldn't need anybody if we were strong in every area. But because we have weaknesses, we see our need for Jesus. We see our need for His grace and His power in our lives. Maybe it's the case when you think about your weakness, you've asked Jesus to take it away. Maybe it's the case that you want nothing more than to get rid of that thorn in your flesh and to get rid of the pain and difficulty that it caused. And so you prayed on multiple occasions for Jesus to take it away. Maybe the reason that it's remained is because it's serving a purpose in your life. Our weaknesses teach us that Jesus' grace is enough. That we don't need all of our weaknesses to be taken away. His grace is sufficient. His grace is enough. Our weaknesses teach us that it's not about us. As we serve Jesus and we strive to make a difference in this world, our weaknesses demonstrate to us it's not about my ability. It's not about me doing everything perfectly. It's not about my strength. It's not about my experiences. Our weaknesses teach us that it's about Jesus. It's about Jesus working through the areas that were weak to demonstrate His indescribable grace and His perfect power to the world. That's why we can boast in our weaknesses. That's why we can be content whenever we're weak. Because those are the moments where Jesus can most clearly be seen in us. I found a quote online that I thought was powerful. It said that God doesn't look to find those who are the elites and those who are the most skilled. Rather, He looks for, what's our key word today? The weak and insignificant who trust in Him. God uses broken pots and vessels. He uses imperfect people who trust in a perfect God. Thus all men will know that it is God who has manifested His power and glory through a brother or sister. It is realized then that it was not the work of men, but the work of God. That's what our weaknesses teach us. That's what our weaknesses show us. Our weaknesses have purpose because they teach us to rely on Jesus and not on ourselves. I read a story about a ship that was crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't a ship like this one. It was a ship that was a little bit older than this one. But the first night that the ship was sailing across the ocean, a big storm came. It caused the waves to get really big, and the ship was just being tossed back and forth. One person on the ship got really seasick. The room was spinning. He constantly felt like he was going to vomit. All that he could do was just lay on his bed, lay on his back, still, feeling absolutely terrible. When all of a sudden, out of his porthole, he heard somebody yell, "Man overboard! Man overboard!" And he heard people panicking, running around, dropping the lifeboat into the water and crying out for that man, hoping to hear a response. The man laying on the bed sick thought, "I can't do anything about this. I can't even get up." And so he started to pray, "God, please help this man. Rescue this man that's fallen overboard. Help us to find him. Because I can't do anything about it." Well, then when he finished his prayer, he thought for just a minute, maybe there is something small I can do. Without ever lifting his head up off the pillow, he grabbed his lamp that was sitting on his nightstand. And he brought it over and sat it in the porthole. He thought maybe just that little bit of light could help. He left it there. Well, the next day, it turns out that the man was saved. The man was rescued. And as he was telling the story about his rescue, he said, "I was about to sink down into the darkness for the last time." He said, "The waves were big, the storm was raging, and I just couldn't swim anymore. I was about to sink down into the water for the last time." When all of a sudden somebody put a light up in their window. And that light shone down on top of my hand. And when it shone down on top of my hand, the people in the lifeboat saw it. And they were able to come over and grab it and pull me into the lifeboat. That man was rescued that day because of what a seasick man was able to do in his weakness. God worked through that man's weakness in order to rescue somebody's life. We all have weaknesses, and that's not a comforting thought. We wish it wasn't that way. It's difficult to think about. But I hope we find encouragement and peace in this fact that even our weaknesses have purpose as Christians. Our weaknesses have purpose because they keep us humble. Our weaknesses have purpose because they teach us to rely on Jesus instead of relying on ourselves. It's like what Paul says at the end of verse 10. You see that phrase? "For when I am weak, then I am strong." That's the case. Because when I'm weak, those are the moments when Jesus is able to demonstrate His grace, His power, and His humility in my life. So how are you allowing Jesus to work through your weaknesses? How are you allowing Jesus to work through the thorns that you have? It might just be the case that when Jesus works through your weakness, you'll be able to shine the light on somebody's hand who's about to sink down into the water for the last time. It might just be the case when Jesus works through your weakness that you can rescue somebody from drowning in their own sin. In order to help rescue others from drowning in their own sin, you first have to take care of yourself. We're not saying today that Jesus works through your sin. Jesus does work through your weakness, but it's because he's taking care of your sin. He takes care of our sin and then uses us as his instruments, working through our weakness to demonstrate his grace and power to the world. You need Jesus to take care of your sins this morning so that he can begin to work through those areas where you're weak. If you have that need, we hope that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.